Greetings, friends. Juan Ingriska here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War update for the week of April 14th through April 20th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and share this video around. And today, and for this week, we are going to be going... Well, actually, before we even start talking about what happened during the week for the front, the most interesting political development is that there is an ongoing Easter ceasefire that it was announced by Putin. It's going to end within like a day or so. So it's been going on for a little over a day now. So it wasn't like a huge, it was like just for the time of Easter. And this is the first, I think, full-time actual ceasefire. Now, obviously, it's not complete perfect. Sometimes there's some shelling, some units, it's not a complete total absence of anything, but for the most part, it is being observed. So this is the first actual ceasefire in this war. I don't think it will be extended. Now, if you guys haven't seen my video on why I think Trump's plan to make peace for Ukraine, why Trump's plan for peace in Ukraine would represent a strategic defeat for the Russian Federation, I suggest you guys watch that video. In that video, I basically explain, so if you're taking things from a purely view of, I just want the war to end. I don't care about the Russian war goals. I don't care about the Ukrainian war goals. I just want this war to end. What Trump is going for is the correct, which is, and the main thing is that we need a ceasefire on the whole line. People keep what they have, and that is it. That is the easiest way if you want peace. But if you're someone who, and a ceasefire also helps the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians tried to push the Russians out of Ukraine in their 2023 offensive. They failed. They tried to exchange it with a Kursk bargain. That failed. And so now the Russians are on the offensive along the entire front. Yes, it's slow, but they are the ones pushing the Ukrainians back. So the Ukrainians want a ceasefire because, as we mentioned, a ceasefire benefits the Ukrainians 100%. So because they're the ones being held back, and then just because there's a ceasefire doesn't mean they can't get. They could keep getting pumped up with weapons. They could keep entrenching themselves. So for the Ukrainians, this is a godsend. Even 3 days might not be enough for any sort of long-term damage. So I think once this ceasefire is over, things will just go back. But any sort of longer ceasefire is 100% a Ukrainian victory. Now, if you are a Russian, as someone who supports the Russian war goals, a ceasefire would represent a complete defeat. For the reasons I mentioned earlier, Ukraine will keep getting funded, will be able to entrench, and so all your humanitarian concerns are paid for with the blood of Russian servicemen, because now they have to assault newly entrenched positions, more funded, more armed Ukrainians. And so any ceasefire would be, and it seems like the Russians understand this, so at the end of the day, this Easter ceasefire, while it's notable to talk about, any sort of actual ceasefire longer than this humanitarian, which I think was a waste of time, but maybe Putin was trying to have them look good on the world stage, maybe for optics reasons. But so maybe it doesn't harm the Russians that much, but anything longer than if say the Russians accepted even just a 30-day ceasefire, that would have been horrible. Because again, a ceasefire is a complete Ukrainian victory. It's a victory for the West. It's a victory for, and it would basically just be negatives all around for Russia. So this Easter ceasefire is, I don't know what Putin was. I mean, I guess I kind of see where Putin's coming from in terms of trying to maybe get some sort of diplomatic optics victory, but and it's not going to really harm the Russians just for a 2-3 day pause. But anything longer would have been disastrous. But anyway, that is something that would be the most interesting thing to talk about. Now let's go to the front line. Let's start in the Turets direction, and this is where the Russians are putting a lot more pressure, specifically in this area between Minigrad and Turets specifically. One of the biggest things is the Russians are continuing breaking through in these villages here, and one of the biggest things is the Russians first have completely captured the village of Valentinovka, this village around this little water reservoir here, and according to most sources, now we don't have any photos yet, but I do expect probably next week we will probably start seeing the Russians raising the flags here, is that according to most pro-Russian sources and even Ukrainian sources, is that the Russians have almost completely captured the village of Sukha Balka. I mentioned that the Russians would do some sort of offensive to take it, and it seems like that's what they continued this week. I can't say they have completely taken it just yet, but I do think that most Ukrainian sources even saying that they've fled, more northwards towards Zarya, Romanovka, and such. But So I can't 100% say it's been taken, but it is basically the battle is almost over for Sukha Balka. As you can see, it has a lot of very good developments. Has a lot of high-rise buildings. It has it would be a very good place for the Russians to accumulate to continue their offensive northwards towards the next Ukrainian line of defense in Zararia, Romanovka, and such. But yeah, one of the biggest is the breakthrough here. They also if you look at maps here, there's a bunch of trenches that are between Sukha Balka and New York, and the Russians have also captured them. So these areas right here. So they have a now continuous defense line between New York and Sukha Balka, which they could use to accumulate forces. So this was a really big thorn in the side of New York. So now with the capture of these areas, the Russians could now develop their offensive further. There's also a line of trenches that lies between Kilanova and Sukha Balka. It seems like as we can see, the Russians are also pushing in the fields here. They actually quite a lot of sources. They actually broke through here and captured a lot of these trenches that are here. So we actually see a bunch of these areas taken by the Russians. So I do expect that with the capture of what happened when they captured Kilanova last week, and now with these capture of Sukha Balka, they'll probably try to converge and liquidate this pocket right here and try to take this tree line, which has a bunch of trench networks here, and then link up Kilanova to Sukha Balka, and then they'll probably start advancing towards Star Mykolaievka. But yeah, the first Ukrainian line defense that ran around Kilanova to Sukha Balka has collapsed, and now the Ukrainians are falling back to the second line defense, which is in Alexandropol, Zoria, and Romanovka. And if the Russians somehow break through here, their last line defense is around Alexandra Kilanovko, around this Kiba and Balka water reservoir here. So there's a few lines of defense the Russians have to break through before they could reach the southern part of Konstantinovka. But yeah, breaking through this first line defense was a very big gain for the Russians here. The next thing is that on the Minigrad area is that the Russians are also pushing in this direction, and we mentioned how this could be where the Russians are also trying to start encircling Minigrad from the east, just as they're trying to encircle Pokrovsk from the west here. They're trying to cut off Minigrad from the east, and one of the biggest things is that, like last week, we talked about how the Russians captured the village of Yesyetovka and did some sort of major offensive here. It seems like now, and we have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the southern part of Miroluplovka. Now, we don't know if the Russians are able to consolidate here. But if they have, then most sources are saying that the southern part of Miroluplovka has been taken by the Russians. So if we look here, right now the battles are going on for the center of this village. If the Russians are able to take it, as you can see, there is a river that divides Miroluplovka from Ukrainian positions that are more near the south of Minigrad here. So this kind of gives them a little bit of a defense here. But I do think the Russians will try to take this village, and then try to take these fields between Mykolaievka, Milinovka, Mirnya, and the main goal here is to basically take these stretch of villages here. Right here, take something like this. And then there's this river that kind of goes something like this. So it let me delete it all. There's this river that splits it here. So the Ukrainians could retreat behind this river. And they also have, the Ukrainians can use this giant Terracon, they can use this giant industrial substation area as defenses. But in terms of cutting up, encircling Leningrad from the east, the Russians could take something, like this. So this is where the Russians will probably try to focus. We've seen an increase in bombardments of the village of Milinovka and Mirnya, so it looks like the Russians are now trying to encircle Leningrad from the east. So we shall see with the entrance of the Russians into this village, this is definitely a one step closer to doing that. But we shall see if the Russians could hold on here. And then in Toretsk itself, we talk, this is the grand finale of Toretsk here. The main biggest thing is that the Russians are now expanding out of Toretsk and now battling for the Ukrainian positions that are on the periphery of it. The biggest thing is that the Russians are now battling for this mining shaft here, this little mining complex. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians getting bombed in this area in the southern part of this mine shaft. So we don't know if the Russians were kicked out here or the Ukrainians hold on to it, but the Russians could hold on to, capture this little mine shaft completely. This would give them a forward operating base to to monitor any Ukrainians that try to break through into northern Toretsk. And so, the battle for the mine shaft is still ongoing. We don't know. We know the Russians were there. We don't know if the Russians were able to kick the Ukrainians fully out, though. So we shall have to monitor for that. And then in the more northern part here, or we shall see the let's call this the eastern part. The Russians are also expanding to make sure the Ukrainians can't just blow into Krimsky or into like the eastern part of Turretsk here. And so we actually have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these tree lines that are around Druzhba. So last week we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these like kind of dachas to the south of this rail line. I do think that the main Russian goal here is to take the village of Dachna, so they could take something like this. And then, as you can see, the Russians have been pushing out and trying to develop their positions on the other side of this the Seversky Donetsk Canal. And the main goal here, obviously, is to then take Dolinovka, take more of these fields near Ozeranovka, and take something like this. So the main goal for the Russians will just kind of have a buffer zone here, and then from here they could then maybe clear up a lot of these Ukrainian trenches that are here, and then this would allow them to secure their base on this mine shaft. And then from there, they could basically try to cut off Novospatsky and Shirobrinka. And, then this would allow them to actually bloom out of Turretsk. So, the battle is now less for Turretsk and now is for its peripheries and the villages around it. So, that is, before the Ukrainians were trying to retake Turretsk, but that failed. So now the Russians are back on the offensive here. So, yeah, that is the Turretsk direction. Now let us go to the Liman direction. Before we go there, I should probably speak about the Chasiv Yar and Seversk direction. There's been no changes in these directions this week. There's battles going on, but there's been no changes in terms of actual land stuff. There's clashes going on for Chasiv Yar and trying to break through. We've been talking about these throughout the last few weeks, but there's been no any big changes this week. But there has been changes is in the Liman direction. So in the Liman direction, the Russians are still expanding their bridgehead on the other side of the Zhirbrets River, and it is going very well. So the main thing right now, one of the biggest things is that the Russians have captured up to 50% of the village of Novi. I talked about this last week, that if the Russians want to actually have a very good, solid position on the other side of the Zhirbrets River, they need to take the village of Novi and Kolodaski. If they could take these two villages, they'll have a very strong position to hold off any sort of Ukrainian counterattacks in this area. Because then, these are two, they're not huge or anything, but they provide a lot of defenses that the Russians could use to hold back any sort of Ukrainian push to try to push them off. Right now, they've kind of stalled in Kolodaski, but where all the changes are happening is in this northern area. And it seems like, and the biggest thing is the Russians are now battling for the village of Novi. As you can see, this village is pretty substantial. Nothing. It's not like a huge city or anything, but as you can see, it provides a lot of buildings the Russians could use. And we have geolocate confirmation that the Russians have captured about 50% of this village. So this area right here, this map doesn't show it just yet. But the only thing the Ukrainians have is this western part of Novi. But I do think the Russians will try to take the rest of this village soon. We also have some map changes showing that the Russians have taken a lot of these fields to right here this week, and they have now reached on the eastern outskirts of the village of Ridodupa. I think the Russians will maybe try to put some positions in these houses on the eastern part here, and then but we shall see if the Russians continue pushing here. It seems like the main Russian goal here is to push kind of in a northwestern direction. Probably try to link up and clear out this pocket here. Probably try to just flatten the front here with the Ukrainian Russian positions in the Kupiansk direction. But it could be double use here. But right now the main focuses are here. So the battle for Novi is going on. I do think the Russians will be able to take this very soon. We also see that the Russians have taken more of these fields to the south of Novi and have reached this road. So the roads have been cut off to Novi. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians, once they take Novi, probably try to take the village of Lipka and Ziladolonia. And then, from something like this. And then from here, then they could actually then take these fields that are to the north of Kolodaski. And then take Kolodaski. And then kind of the main big goal here is something like this. Just kind of push there. And then from here, the Russians could continue pushing north, like I mentioned, but they could also push south. They could try to battle for enter Zarychnia. They could take Stavka. And, just try to, probably one thing that when I think what they're trying to do is link up with the Seversk direction and then, reach the village of Yampil. And then, because that's the main. If they could take Yampil, that basically shows that they're ready to start. Once Yampil is taken, this is the gateway to the southern part of Liman, and then the battle for Liman will start. But they still need to, they're still developing their positions on this other side of the Zhirbrets River here. On the northern part of the Liman direction, they are also continuously expanding. They have captured the village of Novomykolaiivka here. These fields in this little village have been captured this week. So, they took Katerinovka, now they take Novomykolaiivka. They're going to probably take Novi. The Russians will probably continue pushing northwards here, around these villages here. They'll probably also, try to take Ridovgufka, probably try to take Glushnovka, Novomirnya, and then the main goal here is to probably try to take Gerivka, because Gerivka is one of the last villages they have to take in order to completely liberate Luhansk Oblast. It's nothing tactical. Tactically, it's nothing much of a gain, but it is more of a political victory, because right now, the Russians hold 99% of Luhansk Oblast, and so, if they could take the last not even like 1%. They have 99.5%. So if they could take that 0.5% of Luhansk Oblast, then that'd be a very big political victory. This is probably why they're pushing northwards here, because if they could reach here, they basically liberate the rest of Luhansk Oblast, and the only part left would be technically this like Shirobranska forest here. But probably what their goal here, because if they could reach Yampil, they could then cut off the Ukraine positions in this forest here. Anyway. Let's see here. So yeah, that is the Liman direction. Now let us go to the Kupiansk direction, and this is where the Russians are also having, they have their Oskol bridgehead. We haven't really talked about Kupiansk itself yet. There's been some small changes in this direction, actually. The Russians have captured some of these fields to the north of Stepelva Novoselivka, so it looks like they're, trying to finally take this village, but I'm pretty certain this village was razed to the ground. There's probably nothing here left. Yeah, so there's, but they probably are just trying to, improve their positions here a little bit. But there has been some movement here, probably trying to probe Ukrainian defenses. Whoa, I sneezed. Anyway, but in terms of like where all the action's happening, it is on the Oskol bridgehead. The main goals right now for the Russians here is to take the village of Kamyanka. We talked about how the Russians took about half this village last week, and they're still battling for the northern part of Kamyanka. This week, the main changes on the map has been that the Russians have taken some of these fields between Krasnopereshi and Kamyanka, taking this kind of forest here. So, the Russians are just, slowly but surely building up their position so that they could make this a continuous bridgehead here. Because if they could take Kamyanka, then they could, basically have a continuous land bridge, which is connected with Russia proper, into their Dorishnya bridgehead. So, yeah, they're just slowly but surely trying to take Kamyanka. And then where the second part of the Russian offensive is, again, trying to cut off Kupiansk from the north. The main battles has been going on for the village of Kinderosky, which the Ukrainians are still holding on to, because this is a very major village. If the Ukrainians lose this would be a very bad situation for the Ukrainians. We also have some Jilike confirmation the Russians are right on the outskirts of Mala Shapaki, which makes sense. So they have to take this village. They're probably trying to outflank Kinderosky from the north. But we do have GLK confirmation of the Russians being, in this area right here. So we shall see how, the Russians are battling for these villages. The main goal here, obviously, is to take Malashapaki and Kirodasky. If they could do that, they'll have a very solid position. And I do think, maybe the Russians will try to take Mononovki and Dorishva. This will, just protect their flank a lot more better here, and also gives them better high ground positions. And then from here, then they could be in a position to start, battling for northern Kupiansk. So we shall see how that develops, because the main goal here is to take Kupiansk, and probably also the main goal here probably is to take this entire eastern Kharkov region in the big long term. But yeah, so the Kupiansk direction is still ongoing. We shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Sumy direction, the Kursk direction, and this area, the Russians are also making some progress. So in this area, we talked about the village of Gornal last week, and the Russians are now battling for the last village that remains under Ukrainian control in Kursk, Gornal. Now the battle for Gornal has started this week. However, the Russians have made a lot of tactical progress near Gornal, which I think Gornal will be liberated within a week or so. One of the biggest things is that the Russians have completely captured this Gornal monastery, this monastery right here. And so the Russians have captured, this monastery that's on the other side of the Pestle River. They've also captured these fields that are to the north of Gornal. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians now do a major operation to just take the residential area of Gornal and take it fully. So we shall see how that develops. I do think that, the Russians will, take the rest of the Kursk Oblast here. They've already, once they took Wino, they're now expanding out towards the Russia-Ukraine border, and the capture of this monastery in the fields north of it will facilitate the fall of this last village. So yeah, the battle for Gornal is now ongoing. The Russians captured this monastery. We have some Russians raising their flags here. So very good progress for the Russians in terms of liberating the rest of Kursk. Another place where they actually liberated, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense, is that they completely captured the village of Oleshny. I do think this area between the Russian-Ukraine border is a bit more of a gray zone. The Ukrainians obviously have positions in Yunatovka. This is their main position, and they probably have some positions around these fields. And then the Russians, for their part, probably have positions, obviously in Sukha, but also they have some positions in these fields here. But I think the Russian-Ukrainian border is more of a gray zone. But there is battles going on. But according to a lot of pro-Russian sources, they're saying that Oleshny has been completely taken. But the Ukrainians dispute that. So we shall wait and see. But this map does show that Oleshny has been taken, and I do think the main goal here for the Russians will be trying to take these these forests and this village called Satki. But I don't think it's a village. Looks like there's 3 buildings here. Looks pretty cozy. But in any case, the Russians will have to take probably these forests to try to take. One of the main goals for the Russians is Yunatovka, which is one of the main Ukrainian logistics bases here. And obviously the Russians are also pushing into Sumy, and the Russians are continuously doing that. This week, the Russians have captured or are now entering the northern part of Bilodovi, so the Russians are using their positions in these Sumy border towns to push into Bilodovi, which is a pretty big village. It's kind of like Basovka, but it would give the Russians a very strong position to continue pushing to cut off Yunatovka from the west. So they've taken kind of the northern part, or these northern tree lines here. We also have geolocated confirmation the Russians have taken the northern part of Lenovka here, which is the gateway to Yunatovka. I don't think the Russians will continue pushing into Yunatovka unless they cut it off from multiple angles, but taking this village will get them one step closer to reaching the outskirts of this big town here. So, if I had to guess, the Russian goals here would be probably just to take something like this. And then, this is this would give them a very strong, take, a buffer zone here near Suchka. But obviously, this is just for Suchka. There's also, if they want to have a Sumy, if you look in the big picture, a Sumy, border zone, a border zone, a security zone. There's many places they could push. Right now, it's focused on just around Sumy, but there's all these areas around Sumy Oblast that they could use to make where the Ukrainians could still attack. So, but right now, I think they're just trying to push here just to keep the Ukrainians in Sumy. Alrighty. Now let us go to the Zaporozhye direction. And there's been no changes in the Kherson direction, as per usual. But in the Zaporozhye direction, the Russians are now activated. We talked about how, usually when we talk about the Zaporozhye direction, we usually talk about, this area. But there's actually been really no changes in the more western part of Orekov in Zaporozhye. But there's been some changes in the eastern part, and I've been talking about how the Russians will have to activate in this area to start cutting off Orekov from the east here, just as they try to cut off Orekov from the west here. But the biggest thing is the Russians have entered the village of Malotokhnachka. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians entering the most eastern part of Malotokhnachka and having positions here. We shall see if the Russians are able to hold on here. But the main goal for the Russians here is to take this former prison colony right here. If the Russians could take this prison, this would give them a very strong position to hold Malotokhnachka. And then, the main goal here is to take it, and then this could outflank the Ukrainians in Novodolinovka. The Russians will obviously try to also push from their positions here to take Novoandriivka. And then, they're trying to take these villages that are all around Orekov, just all these villages here. And then from here, the Russians could then try to, probably take Novopalovka, cut off this area here, and maybe try to push through these fields here towards, Omelette here and all that. But anyway, the main goal here is to take Orekov here. I don't think this is not where the main Russian push is, but it does seem like the Russians are activating here just to keep Ukrainian reserves pinned down here. Alrighty. Now let us go to the South Donetsk direction. The only thing really was the Molotov, which is something notable to talk about, but that was the only changes in the Zaporozhye direction. But in the South Donetsk direction, there's also been just some small changes. The battles around Velika Novosovka there's nothing changed here. The Russians are still trying to enter Shemtenko. They're still battling for Leopolia. And all that. But there's been no really big changes here. Where there has been changes is more around Baratar in this area, the South Donetsk direction, and such. The biggest changes here is that the Russians have taken more of these fields around, in the south of Baratar. Have taken, some of these fields right here near Roseville. So this shows that, and we also talked about last week, the Russians are expanding north of Rozdolnia here. So they took these fields. So it looks like the Russians are getting step by step closer and closer to Ordarnia and Baratar. So just taking some fields one step at a time, just like when they took Roseville. So just some small changes there. The Ukrainians are trying to do counterattacks here, trying to push the Russians out of Dnieper Energy. From Kamar. So right now the Russians are trying to hold on to their positions here, because if they could hold on to here, then the Russians could take Fedorovka. They could then take some of these fields. But if the Ukrainians could push the Russians out of Dnieper Energy, then the Russian flank will be exposed. So that's why the Ukrainians are trying to do counterattacks, but the Russians are right now holding on to Dnieper Energy so far. So yeah, that is the South Donetsk direction. Now let us go to the last direction that we will talk about, is the Pokrovsk direction. And this also doesn't have that much changes, but there's been some small changes. Like in the Taras direction, this used to be the area where the Ukrainians were giving the Russians a hard time, but now the Russians are fighting back. The main thing to talk about is there's been no changes in this kind of area where they're trying to reach the Dnieper Oblast, but there's been some changes near Pokrovsk. The biggest thing is that the Russians have recaptured the eastern part of Udashna. We have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this area. We have them being in this little industrial zone. So the Russians are here. We also have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this area right here. So Koltuna, one thing about Syriac maps is they rely a lot on Deep State map, which is a pro-Ukrainian map. And sometimes those pro-Ukrainians a little bit, they're pretty good, but they're not. Sometimes they go a little off the mark and such. So we do have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this farm, being in this area. So the Russians are in this position here. So, so right now the battle for Udashna is now ongoing, but we shall see if the Russians could expand their positions here. And then also, the Ukrainians had changed their minds. They said Uspenivka, at least the western part, is still under Ukrainian control. I don't know how this battle is still ongoing. I think Uspenivka has been razed to the ground already, so there's probably nothing left to hold on to here. But yeah, we shall see how the Russians develop here. But yeah, so the battle for Uspenivka is still ongoing. I didn't expect anything less. But the Russians are still, are now back in Udashna and Koltuna in full force and are holding on to their positions here. But besides that, there's been nothing really else changing here. Alrighty, that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukrainian update. Be sure, if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and comment your thoughts, and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.